Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransitioned male. I transitioned at 28 years old. I was on hormones for 8 years and I identified as trans feminine for 8 years until I recently detransitioned both hormonally and socially. And now I'm spending time in this channel talking about trans stuff, gender, particularly with respect to the nuances of my own personal story, which have to do with cross-dressing and autogynephilia and stuff like this, and how it ties into gender and transness and identity and everything in between. So today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between gender dysphoria and this idea of being true trans, because there is this idea out there, common misconception about autogynephilia, which is that, there's this distinction between true transsexuals who have legitimate gender dysphoria, which is a medical condition, versus the AGPs or autogynephiles who, transition because it's like a kink or a paraphilia or a fetish. And so, a lot of people will make this distinction between true transsexuals versus AGPs and say that the thing that distinguishes them is true transsexuals have gender dysphoria, whereas the AGPs don't have gender dysphoria. They only have gender euphoria, which is really a kind of sexual arousal or sexual attraction to the idea of being a woman. And so they say well, the AGPs don't have gender dysphoria and the true transsexuals do have gender dysphoria. And this is a misconception in my opinion, because let's actually look at the DSM and how the DSM-5 defines the criteria for gender dysphoria. Because I think there's a lot of confusion, because a common misconception is that gender dysphoria is defined only insofar as there is a marked incongruence between your experience of gender and your own physical primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So in other words, they will say that gender dysphoria is defined by essentially hating your sexed body in some way. So they'll say if you don't dislike your sexed body, if your genitals and your sexed body don't strongly give you all kinds of psychological discomfort, then you're not really trans. You're just a AGP, trender, kinkster, pervert, or something like this. But let's actually look at the definition in the DSM-5 of how gender dysphoria is defined. It is a marked incongruence between one's expressed gender and their assigned gender, lasting at least 6 months, as manifested by at least 2 of the following. And then it goes into these different aspects or criteria, and you only need 2 of them. And a lot of them, a lot of these criteria are about a marked incongruence between one's experienced gender and your primary and secondary sex characteristics, and or a desire to be rid of one's primary and secondary sex characteristics, which falls into the sort of classical transsexual narrative, that the true transsexual narrative in terms of having it primarily focused on the body. However, I want to point out that there are 2 criteria in this DSM definition of gender dysphoria. Let me read them. a strong desire to be of the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender, and a strong desire to be treated as the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. That's straight out of the DSM-5 for defining gender dysphoria. Notice how that does not indicate anything about, a desire to rid oneself of one's primary and secondary sex characteristics. It's only about desiring to be the other gender. Now, what does it mean to be the other gender or be treated as the other gender? Because take being treated as the other gender. If you had a desire to, wear women's clothing and pass and have long hair and makeup and, you had, strong pleasure associated with, cross-dressing as a woman and living as a woman. That comes from being, and that process would, essentially bring you into the social life of trying to live as a woman in some way, a social transition. You can be happy with having your penis, your genitals, and still have this desire to be treated as the other gender, or you can desire to be the other gender without necessarily desiring to embody every aspect of the anatomy of the other gender. So this is why the DSM distinguishes between desires related to primary and secondary sex characteristics and a more generic desire to be the other gender, or a desire to be treated as the other gender. And in my interpretation, this desire to be the other gender or desire to be treated as the other gender, that falls more in line with gender euphoria. It is a desire to basically manifest that aspect of being a woman or something like that. And the desire doesn't necessarily have to manifest in terms of dislike of one's body, but more being pulled into that social reality through euphoria or positive pleasure, positive desire. Like this definition, doesn't require one to hate one's penis, for example. And this was true in my case. So when I transitioned at 28 years old, I did not have a dislike of my penis, for example. I never had surgery or anything like this, and that was never something I really wanted. But I strongly wanted to, appear as if I was a woman. I wanted to dress like a woman, have long hair, wear women's clothing, adopt a feminine persona that I had constructed, and live out this social life, essentially be a full-time cross-dresser. And, it just so happens that, being a full-time cross-dresser with a male identity is far more difficult socially than being a full-time cross-dresser with a female social identity, aka a trans feminine person. So I sort of intuited that my life would be easier in terms of manifesting these desires to be the other gender if I lived out the social reality of trying to live as a woman, or at least taking on certain aspects of womanhood, like a female name, going by she, her pronouns, etc., etc. But, at the same time, I realized that hormones would make this process of being a full-time cross-dresser easier because, attempting your best to pass, to put effort into your appearance, that makes your life easier as a trans woman, as a trans feminine person. So I had 11 or 12 rounds of laser hair removal on my beard. I took the hormones because all this would facilitate my desire to be the other gender and to be treated as the other gender, even if that didn't necessarily mean my desire to be rid of my primary and secondary sex characteristics. That was not the driving impetus for the the transition itself, or it was more so driven by gender euphoria. I was driven to transition and come out as trans even before I decided to go on hormones or decided I even wanted hormones, because when I first came out and identified and adopted the trans identity, I wasn't even sure I wanted hormones, because at that point in time, I did not desire to be rid of my primary and secondary sex characteristics. But, once I started transitioning, once I, started trying to live this life of being the other gender socially as a full-time cross-dresser, I eventually came to desire to have the secondary sex characteristics, because that made my life so much easier, and it tied into the euphoria of being hyper feminine, because that is related to my autogynephilia. So hopefully now you can see that the question of whether or not gender dysphoria is the thing that distinguishes between true transsexuals, or HSTS, and AGPs or whatever. I don't think gender dysphoria is the thing that distinguishes that, because one, looking at the DSM-5, the AGP desires about embodying femininity don't necessarily have to do with hating your body. You can desire, to embody femininity through your behavior, your clothing, being treated interpersonally as a woman, all these different aspects. And for some AGPs, it is about the anatomy, and it is about the body. So for some AGPs, they do strongly desire for the primary and secondary sex characteristics of the other gender. That is one of the definitions, or one of the criteria in the DSM. Now, the DSM doesn't say where the desire has to come from. If the desire for the primary and secondary characteristics has its causal etiological origins in one's sexual orientation, that does not disqualify you from the specified criteria in the DSM. It just is a strong desire. It doesn't say the strong desire has to be of a non-sexual nature. It just has to be a desire for this stuff. So AGP in and of itself is in no way incompatible with being diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And I actually have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria on my medical record. And I don't think I, went out of my way to lie and deceive my doctors and therapists who gave me this, diagnosis. Like, I just told them my desires, even though at the time I wasn't really conceptualizing those desires in terms of AGP, but I still knew that my desire to be trans, to go on the hormones, to socially transition, it was driven by euphoria of embodying the other gender and the aspects of clothing and femininity of the other gender, rather than a hatred of my body. But that still falls in line with the DSM definition of gender dysphoria. So I just want to clear up that distinction, because it's a common misconception where, people will say that like true transsexuals have gender dysphoria, and and AGPs do not, or people will say like, oh, well, you detransition, so you must have never had gender dysphoria, or you're just a cross-dresser, you never had gender dysphoria. Like, cross-dressing and gender dysphoria are compatible. So that's the purpose of this video. Hopefully that cleared up some misconceptions about autogynephilia and gender dysphoria and the relationship between true trans and AGP, etc. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.